Margaret O'Sullivan's weathered hands froze on the coffee mug as the scratching at her front door turned into desperate, rhythmic tapping. At 5:30 a.m. on this bitter December morning, she expected no visitors. The scratching wasn't random. It was deliberate, pleading. When she opened the heavy oak door, her breath caught in her throat. A bear cub, no bigger than a cocker spaniel, sat shivering on her welcome mat, one tiny paw raised as if knocking. Its dark eyes, those unmistakable eyes, stared directly into hers with an intelligence that made her knees buckle. "Dear Lord," she whispered, recognizing the same soulful gaze that had haunted her dreams for 18 months. Tyler's panicked voice echoed from upstairs. "Grandma, what's wrong?" This was the offspring of the bear that had saved her grandson's life and killed her son-in-law. The cub wore a makeshift collar of frayed rope, and hanging from it was a torn piece of Tyler's jacket from that terrible night in the mountains. How had it found them, and why now, when they could least afford another mouth to feed? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret O'Sullivan had spent 72 years learning that life rarely gave second chances. Widowed at 68, she lived alone in the 2-story log cabin that her late husband Frank had built with his own hands in the shadow of Colorado's Cascade Mountains. The $1,200 monthly Social Security check stretched thin, covering her heart medication, heating bills, and little else. Most days, she ate one meal so her daughter's family could have 3. Her unfulfilled dream sat dusty on the mantel, a framed acceptance letter to Colorado State University's veterinary program from 1968. She'd never enrolled. Her father's stroke had demanded her attention, then marriage, children, and 5 decades of putting everyone else's needs before her own. "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," she'd whispered during the hardest times, though lately she wondered if he'd forgotten about her altogether. The cabin buzzed with the controlled chaos of a struggling single-parent household. Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's 38-year-old daughter, worked 2 jobs. Morning shifts at the diner and evening cleaning at the medical center, trying to keep her family afloat since her husband Robert's death 18 months ago. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once bright smile appeared only when her boys needed encouragement. Tyler, 11 years old, with his father's sandy hair and his grandmother's gentle nature, still woke screaming from nightmares about that terrible night in the mountains. The boy who once fearlessly climbed trees now flinched at shadows. His older brother Marcus, 17 and painfully practical, had appointed himself the family's voice of reason, often clashing with Margaret's foolish sentimentality. "Grandma lives in a fairy tale," Marcus would mutter when Margaret fed stray cats or gave her last $5 to homeless veterans. "We can barely feed ourselves." The family's financial wounds ran deep. Tyler's medical bills from the mountain accident still arrived monthly, $847 for the helicopter rescue, $1,200 for emergency surgery, countless smaller amounts for follow-up care. Jennifer had sold her engagement ring, pawned Frank's tools, and borrowed against the house's equity. They were drowning slowly, one bill at a time. Margaret felt invisible in her own home, a burden rather than a blessing. Her arthritic hands shook when she tried to help with cooking. Her hearing made phone conversations difficult. The family spoke around her, not to her, assuming she wouldn't understand modern problems. "I spent 50 years taking care of everyone else," she told her reflection just yesterday morning. "Now who's going to take care of me?" The question hung unanswered in the empty kitchen, but something had shifted this morning. The desperate scratching at her door hadn't been random. It was purposeful, intelligent. As she stared at the bear cub's pleading eyes, Margaret felt a spark she hadn't experienced in years. This tiny creature needed her specifically, had somehow found her among thousands of homes in the valley. For the first time since Frank's death, Margaret O'Sullivan felt chosen. The bear cub collapsed the moment Margaret lifted it into her arms. Its tiny body felt like ice wrapped in matted fur, and she could count its ribs through the thin coat. Tyler thundered down the stairs, followed by Marcus, both boys stopping dead when they saw what their grandmother cradled. "Is that?" Tyler's voice cracked with recognition. "Same eyes," Margaret whispered, her weathered fingers gently examining the cub. "Same soul." Her dormant veterinary training kicked in automatically. Hypothermia. The cub's gums were pale, its breathing shallow. Dehydration showed in the sunken eyes and dry nose. Worse, she discovered an infected puncture wound on its left hind paw, probably from a porcupine quill that had festered. "Marcus, get towels from the linen closet." "Tyler, start a fire in the fireplace." Margaret's voice carried an authority her family hadn't heard in years. "This baby's dying." "Grandma, we can't," Marcus began. "We can, and we will." Margaret's steel-gray eyes flashed with determination. "Some things are more important than convenience, child." As she worked to warm the cub with heating pads and blankets, the makeshift collar around its neck caught her attention. Rough rope, obviously crafted by paws rather than hands, held a small bundle wrapped in familiar fabric. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it, a piece of Tyler's torn jacket from that horrible night, still carrying his scent after 18 months. Tyler gasped when he recognized it. "That's from my coat. The one I lost when Mama Bear saved your life," Margaret finished softly. The cub's eyes fluttered open at Tyler's voice, and something magical happened. The tiny creature lifted its head weakly and made a soft, chuffing sound, not distress but recognition. It knew Tyler. "This isn't coincidence," Margaret declared, positioning the cub near the fireplace. "This baby traveled miles to find us." "Its mama sent it here." Marcus paced anxiously. "Grandma, this is insane. Harboring wild animals is illegal. Mom could lose her jobs. We could all be arrested." "Your mother's at work," Margaret replied, mixing warm milk with honey. "What she doesn't know won't hurt her yet." The cub accepted the makeshift formula eagerly, its small paws gripping Margaret's finger with surprising strength. Color began returning to its gums as warmth spread through its body. "Look," Tyler whispered in wonder. "It's getting better already." But Margaret's practiced eye saw complications ahead. The infected paw needed antibiotics, strong ones that would cost serious money. Her mental calculations were grim. Animal antibiotics from the feed store would run at least $600, plus wound care supplies, special nutrition, and potential emergency veterinary bills. $600 represented half her monthly income. "We need medicine," she told the boys. "Real medicine, not home remedies." Marcus's practical nature exploded. "With what money, Grandma? We're already behind on utilities. Mom's working herself to death. And you want to spend our grocery money on a bear?" "This bear's family died protecting ours," Margaret shot back. "We owe them." Tyler knelt beside the cub, which had curled up against the boy's leg like a house cat. "He likes me, Grandma, just like his mama did." The cub responded only to Margaret's voice commands and Tyler's gentle touch, completely ignoring Marcus's attempts at interaction. When Margaret spoke softly, its ears perked up. When she moved away, it whimpered until she returned. "It's like he knows you saved him," Tyler observed. Margaret felt something she'd forgotten existed: purpose. This tiny creature depended entirely on her knowledge, her care, her decisions. For the first time in years, someone truly needed her. "I'm calling Mom," Marcus declared, reaching for his phone. "You'll do no such thing." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "Your mother has enough worries. This little one needs immediate care, and I'm the only person in this house qualified to give it." The boys watched in amazement as their grandmother transformed before their eyes. The frail, uncertain woman they'd grown accustomed to disappeared, replaced by someone confident and capable. She cleaned the infected wound with steady hands, applied antibiotic ointment from her medicine cabinet, and bandaged the paw with professional precision. "How do you know all this?" Tyler asked. Margaret smiled sadly. "I was going to be a veterinarian once, long time ago." As the morning wore on, the cub's condition stabilized but didn't improve dramatically. The infection was too advanced for over-the-counter remedies. Real veterinary antibiotics were essential, and they had to be obtained within 24 hours, or the infection could turn septic. Margaret stared at her meager bank balance on her phone screen. $847.32. After rent, utilities, and medication, she had perhaps $200 for food until next month's check arrived. The medicine would cost 3 times that amount. But looking at the cub sleeping peacefully beside Tyler, both of them breathing in synchronized rhythm, Margaret O'Sullivan made a decision that would change everything. "Tyler, help me get this baby to the truck. We're going to town." The black SUV with federal plates pulled into Margaret's driveway just as she was loading the bear cub into her old pickup truck. Agent Daniel Morrison emerged like a storm cloud, his imposing 6-foot frame casting shadows across the morning snow. At 52, his face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd seen too much and forgiven too little. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." His voice cut through the mountain air with bureaucratic authority. "I'm Agent Morrison with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service." Margaret clutched the bundled cub closer to her chest. "This baby's sick. I'm taking him to get medicine." "That animal is federal property under the Endangered Species Act. Harboring it is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and $50,000 in fines." Morrison's badge glinted in the pale sunlight as he approached. "Turn it over immediately." Tyler stepped protectively in front of his grandmother. "You can't take him. He came to us for help." Morrison's gray eyes fixed on the boy with unsettling intensity. "Son, that's a dangerous predator. Its kind killed your father, didn't they?" "That's not true." Tyler's voice cracked with emotion. "Mama Bear saved me." According to official reports, Robert Walsh died from injuries sustained in a bear attack while camping. Morrison pulled out a thick file folder. "The same species that killed your father is what you're protecting now. How's that for irony?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "You're lying. Robert died from the fall when he tried to rescue Tyler." Morrison's smile held no warmth. "Check the death certificate, ma'am. Cause of death, trauma consistent with large predator attack. I filed that report myself." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She'd been at the hospital when Robert died, had held Jennifer's hand during those terrible hours. The doctors had mentioned massive internal injuries from the fall, broken ribs that punctured his lung. No one had ever mentioned bear attacks. Marcus appeared in the doorway, cell phone in hand. "Grandma, what's going on?" "Your grandmother is harboring illegal wildlife," Morrison explained with practiced patience. "I'm here to correct that situation before someone else gets hurt." "The cub is injured," Margaret insisted, unwrapping the bandaged paw. "Look at this infection. Without antibiotics, he'll die." Morrison glanced dismissively at the wound. "Nature has a way of handling these things, ma'am. Survival of the fittest and all that." "You heartless—" Margaret bit back the words, recognizing the futility of arguing with a man whose mind was already made. "I'm giving you one opportunity to surrender the animal voluntarily," Morrison continued, checking his watch. "Otherwise, I'll return with federal marshals and a search warrant." "You have 48 hours. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma, don't let him take Hope." "Hope?" Morrison's expression darkened. "You've named it? Lady, you've just made this situation 10 times worse." Margaret studied Morrison's face, noting how his jaw tightened whenever he looked at the cub. This wasn't just about following regulations. Something personal drove his determination. "Why do you hate them so much?" she asked quietly. Morrison's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and wounded underneath. Because they're killers, ma'am. Every single one of them. And people like you who romanticize these predators end up getting innocent folks hurt. This baby hasn't hurt anyone. Yet. Morrison's voice turned cold again. But it will. They all do eventually. The federal agent walked slowly around Margaret's property, taking notes on a small pad. His trained eye cataloged potential hiding spots, exit routes, and security vulnerabilities with military precision. "Nice place you have here," he commented, his tone deceptively casual. "Isolated. Good for keeping secrets, I imagine." Margaret didn't like the implied threat. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just observing that sometimes elderly people living alone make poor decisions. Cognitive decline, you know, happens to the best of us." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Judges tend to be sympathetic in cases involving diminished capacity." Marcus stepped forward angrily. "Don't you dare!" "It's all right, honey." Margaret placed a steadying hand on her grandson's arm. "Mr. Morrison is just doing his job. Aren't you, Agent?" Morrison pocketed his notebook. 48 hours, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As his SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Margaret felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. The cub needed immediate medical attention that would cost money they didn't have. Even if she could afford the antibiotics, she now risked federal prosecution for trying to save an innocent creature. Tyler broke the heavy silence. "Grandma, what are we going to do?" Margaret looked down at Hope, who had dozed fitfully through the confrontation. The cub's breathing remained labored, and the infected paw felt warm to the touch, despite the cold morning air. Without treatment, sepsis would set in within days. "We're going to save him," she said firmly. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "Did you not hear what that guy said? 5 years in prison, $50,000 fine. Mom would lose everything." "Sometimes doing what's right costs more than we want to pay," Margaret replied, remembering her own mother's words from decades past. "But the cost of doing nothing is always higher." She carried Hope back into the house, her mind racing through possibilities. The veterinary clinic in town would refuse to treat wild animals without proper permits. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 3 hours away and would immediately contact federal authorities. Underground veterinarians existed, but finding one would take time. Hope didn't have. "There's got to be someone who will help us," Tyler said desperately. Margaret settled into her rocking chair with Hope curled in her lap, the same chair where she'd nursed Jennifer through childhood illnesses and rocked Tyler through countless bedtime stories. "There is someone," she said slowly, an idea forming. "Dr. Sarah Hendricks. She was a classmate of mine back when I was studying veterinary science. She ran an underground railroad for injured wildlife during the 1980s when environmental protections were weaker." "Is she still alive?" Marcus asked skeptically. Margaret smiled for the first time that morning. "Honey, us old ladies are tougher than we look." Dr. Sarah Hendricks lived in a converted barn 20 miles deeper into the mountains, where cell service disappeared and privacy reigned absolute. At 75, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades treating creatures that could kill her with a misplaced claw. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent healing wild things. "Margaret O'Sullivan," she breathed, opening her door to find her old classmate holding a bundled bear cub. "I wondered when you'd finally come calling." The barn's interior had been transformed into a fully equipped veterinary clinic, complete with surgical tables, X-ray machines, and temperature-controlled recovery kennels. Dozens of animals in various stages of healing occupied the space. An owl with a splinted wing, a fox recovering from leg surgery, and what appeared to be a young mountain lion sleeping peacefully in a large enclosure. "You've been busy," Margaret observed, gently placing Hope on the examination table. 40 years of fixing what humans break," Sarah replied, immediately focusing on the cub. Her experienced hands explored Hope's body with gentle efficiency. Severe dehydration, mild hypothermia, and this paw. When did the infection start? "We found him this morning. I'm guessing the wound is at least a week old." Sarah's expression grew serious as she examined the infected puncture more closely. "This needs immediate surgical intervention. The infection has started tracking up his leg. Another day or two and we're looking at sepsis." "Can you save him?" Tyler asked anxiously. "I can try, but it won't be cheap or easy." Sarah began gathering supplies. "Antibiotics alone will run $600. If we need surgery to clean out the infection, add another $800. And there's no guarantee." Margaret's heart sank. Even with her meager savings, she was several $100s short. "I'll find the money somehow." Sarah paused in her preparations, studying Margaret's weathered face. "There's something else you need to know. This isn't just any bear cub. Look at these markings." She pointed to distinctive white patches on Hope's chest and behind his ears. "This is consistent with a genetic line I've been tracking for years. Highly intelligent, unusually social, and extremely loyal to specific human families." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked. "It means this baby didn't find you by accident. His mother was part of a family group that's been living in harmony with humans for generations. They're almost extinct now. Hunters and government agents have systematically eliminated them because they're considered problematic." Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. Problematic how? "They form bonds with humans. They protect territory that includes human families. They've been documented sharing resources, warning people of dangers, even helping with search and rescue operations. But the Fish and Wildlife Service classifies them as habituated bears and marks them for removal." Tyler's eyes widened. "That's why Mama Bear saved me. She was protecting our family." Sarah nodded gravely. "And why Agent Morrison is so determined to eliminate this cub. He knows exactly what Hope represents." While Sarah prepared for surgery, Margaret found herself alone with Hope for a few minutes. The cub's labored breathing reminded her of Frank during his final days. The same struggle for each breath, the same quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. "I failed so many people," she whispered to the sleeping animal. "Failed to become the veterinarian I dreamed of being, failed to keep Frank healthy, failed to protect Robert, failed to provide for my family." Her voice cracked. "But I won't fail you, little one." "Not you." Hope's eyes opened at her voice and he made a soft chuffing sound, not distress but comfort, as if he understood her pain and was trying to offer solace. "Grandma?" Tyler appeared beside her. "I started a GoFundMe page for Hope's medical bills." Margaret looked at her grandson with surprise. "Honey, I don't even know what that is." "It's like online fundraising. People donate money for causes they care about." Tyler showed her his phone screen. "I called it Help Bear Grandma Save Hope and told our story. Look." The page had been live for only 2 hours, but donations were already trickling in. $5 from Anonymous, $25 from Bear Lover 1234, $10 from Grandma Fan. "People actually care?" Margaret marveled. "More than you know," Marcus said, joining them. "I shared it on TikTok with the hashtag #BearGrandma. It's getting crazy attention." Sarah emerged from her supply room with an armload of medical equipment. "Ready for surgery, but I need to warn you, this is going to be touch and go. The infection is worse than I initially thought." The next 4 hours blurred together in a haze of anxiety and hope. Sarah worked with the skill of a surgeon half her age, carefully debriding infected tissue and flushing the wound with antibiotics. Margaret assisted, her dormant veterinary training returning like muscle memory. "Hand me the irrigation syringe," Sarah instructed, and Margaret's response was automatic, professional. "You still have it," Sarah observed. "The touch. You could have been magnificent in this field." "Life had other plans," Margaret replied, but for the first time in decades, she didn't sound bitter about it. Tyler monitored Hope's vital signs, while Marcus documented the surgery on his phone, live streaming to growing audiences on multiple social media platforms. Comments poured in from around the world, words of encouragement, small donations, and stories from others who'd experienced similar human-animal bonds. "Grandma, look at this," Marcus said excitedly. "A wildlife photographer in Alaska just donated $500. She says she's documented bear families protecting human settlements for years." The GoFundMe page began climbing rapidly. $100, then $500, then $1,000. Stories accompanied the donations. A rancher in Montana whose family had been protected by wolves. A woman in Maine whose life was saved by a bear that warned her away from a dangerous cliff. An elderly man in Wyoming whose grandfather had formed a decades-long friendship with a grizzly family. People understand, Margaret realized. They know these connections are real. As Sarah completed the surgery, Jennifer Walsh arrived home from her morning shift at the diner, exhausted and unsuspecting. The sight of federal vehicles in her driveway earlier had been reported by concerned neighbors, but she had no idea what awaited her inside. "Mom?" Jennifer's voice carried from the front door. "Boys, why is there a veterinary truck in our driveway?" Tyler ran to intercept his mother, but she'd already spotted the makeshift surgical suite in the living room. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally, resigned understanding. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is," Jennifer said weakly. "It's Hope," Tyler explained quickly. "The baby bear whose mama saved me. He came to us for help, Mom. We couldn't just let him die." Jennifer sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Agent Morrison was already here. Federal agents, Mom. They're threatening prison time." "Sometimes prison is preferable to living with regret," Margaret said quietly, not looking up from monitoring Hope's recovery. "Easy for you to say." Jennifer's exhaustion exploded into anger. "You don't have 2 children depending on you. You don't work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. You don't—" She stopped, seeing the hurt in her mother's eyes. Sarah looked up from cleaning her instruments. "Jennifer, your mother just performed veterinary surgery at a level that would impress most licensed professionals. She's been caring for this animal with skills that most people don't possess. She dropped out of veterinary school 50 years ago." "Some knowledge doesn't fade," Sarah replied gently. "And some callings are too strong to ignore forever." Hope began stirring as the anesthesia wore off, and Margaret was immediately at his side, speaking in soothing tones. The cub's eyes focused on her face, and his breathing seemed to ease at her voice. "Look at that response," Sarah marveled. "I've never seen such immediate bonding. It's like he imprinted on you specifically." Jennifer watched her mother with hope, seeing something she'd forgotten existed, Margaret's natural gift with injured creatures, the gentle confidence that had once made her dream of healing animals professionally. "The GoFundMe is at $3,500, Marcus announced. "And it's accelerating. Someone from National Geographic just shared our story." "$3,500? Jennifer repeated, stunned. Tyler nodded excitedly. "People are calling Grandma a hero. They're saying she represents everything good about standing up for innocent creatures." "The comments are incredible," Marcus added, reading from his phone. "This grandmother shows more courage than most politicians. Real heroes don't wear capes, they rock in chairs and heal broken hearts. If more people had Margaret O'Sullivan's moral compass, the world would be a better place." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the attention. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," No, Jennifer said softly, her anger replaced by something deeper. You're doing what only you would do, Mom. What only you could do. Sarah finished administering post-surgical antibiotics to Hope. He needs round-the-clock monitoring for the next 48 hours. Someone needs to check his temperature every 2 hours, ensure he's eating, watch for signs of complications. I'll do it, Margaret said immediately. Mom, you need sleep, Jennifer began. I'll sleep when he's safe, Margaret replied with finality. This baby trusted me enough to come to our door. I won't betray that trust by handing him over to someone who wants him dead. As evening approached, Hope's condition continued to stabilize. His temperature dropped to normal ranges, and he began accepting small amounts of formula every few hours. More importantly, his eyes remained bright and alert, tracking movement and responding to voices. The surgery was successful, Sarah announced, but the real test comes over the next week. Infection can still set in, and stress from the ordeal might cause other complications. What about Morrison? Jennifer asked the question everyone was avoiding. Margaret's jaw set with determination. Agent Morrison said I have 48 hours. That was 8 hours ago. I intend to use every remaining minute to make sure Hope is strong enough to survive whatever comes next. The GoFundMe page continued climbing throughout the evening, eventually topping $5,000. More importantly, messages of support poured in from across the country. Veterinarians offering services, lawyers volunteering legal assistance, and wildlife advocates sharing resources for fighting federal overreach. Grandma, Tyler said as they settled in for the night-long vigil. You're famous. They're calling you the Bear Grandma. Margaret smiled tiredly, adjusting Hope's blankets. Fame never mattered to me, honey. But if it helps save this little one, I'll take all the attention they want to give. As midnight approached, Hope slept peacefully for the first time since his arrival. His breathing was steady, his color good, and his appetite gradually returning. Margaret dozed fitfully in her rocking chair beside him, waking every few hours to check his condition. At 3 a.m., Tyler found his grandmother awake, gently stroking Hope's fur as the cub slept. Can't sleep either? She asked softly. Tyler shook his head. I keep thinking about Mama Bear, how she knew to send Hope to us. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Maybe she knew I needed him as much as he needed us. Maybe this was her gift, giving an old woman a chance to finally be the healer she always wanted to be. Outside, snow began falling again, covering the mountain in pristine white. Inside the warm cabin, an elderly woman and a bear cub began healing together, both finding purpose they'd thought was lost forever. But in 32 hours, Agent Morrison would return, and Margaret O'Sullivan would face the most important choice of her life. The storm arrived with Morrison. At exactly 48 hours after his first visit, 3 black SUVs pulled into Margaret's driveway through swirling snow, their headlights cutting through the afternoon gloom like accusatory fingers. Agent Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by 4 federal marshals in tactical gear and Dr. Patricia Vance, the state's chief wildlife veterinarian. Margaret stood on her front porch holding Hope, who had grown noticeably stronger over the past 2 days. The GoFundMe page had exploded to over $15,000, and news vans from Denver had joined the growing crowd of supporters who'd driven up the mountain to stand with the woman they'd dubbed Bear Grandma. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Morrison called through a bullhorn, surrender the animal immediately, or face arrest for violation of federal wildlife protection statutes. The crowd behind the federal agents had grown to nearly 100 people. Neighbors, animal rights activists, and strangers who'd driven hours to witness this confrontation. They held signs reading, "Save Hope," "Grandmas Know Best," and "Love Over Law." Several local news stations broadcasted live as the tension escalated. "That bear belongs in professional care," Dr. Vance announced, stepping forward with a transport cage. Continued exposure to human contact is detrimental to its natural development. Margaret's voice carried clearly in the cold air. This baby was dying when he came to us. Look at him now. She held Hope higher so the cameras could capture his bright eyes and healthy appearance. Does he look detrimental to you? Hope, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, made a soft chuffing sound that the crowd interpreted as support for Margaret. The gathered supporters erupted in cheers, chanting, "Bear Grandma! Bear Grandma!" Morrison's patience evaporated. This is a law enforcement operation, not a publicity stunt. Clear the area immediately. This is still America, shouted back Margaret's neighbor, Bill Henderson, a Vietnam veteran who'd lived next door for 30 years. Last I checked, old ladies were allowed to stand on their own property. Tyler and Marcus flanked their grandmother, creating a protective barrier around Hope. Jennifer had called in sick to work, the first time in 2 years, to stand with her family. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Jennifer whispered urgently. "We can find another way." "There is no other way, honey," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Sometimes you have to plant yourself like a tree and say, 'No, you move.'" Dr. Vance approached with clinical detachment. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I've reviewed the animal's condition remotely through social media posts. While your care has been adequate, this bear requires specialized rehabilitation to prepare for eventual release into the wild." "Eventual release?" Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "You mean eventual euthanasia when he fails to readjust to wild conditions after being bottle-fed and hand-raised?" Dr. Vance's momentary hesitation confirmed Margaret's suspicions. The crowd sensed the admission and grew restless, pressing closer to the federal agents despite orders to maintain distance. Morrison raised the bullhorn again. "This is your final warning. Surrender the animal or face immediate arrest." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Hope, who had been calm in Margaret's arms, suddenly became agitated. The cub's attention fixed on something beyond the crowd, and he began making urgent vocalizations, not distress calls, but what sounded like warnings. "What's wrong with him?" Tyler asked. Margaret followed Hope's gaze and gasped. Emerging from the tree line at the edge of her property were 3 adult black bears, 2 females and a massive male. They moved with purpose, not aggression, positioning themselves between the crowd and the forest. The gathered people noticed the bears, and panic rippled through their ranks. Several supporters began backing toward their vehicles, but the bears made no threatening gestures. Instead, they sat down in the snow, watching the proceedings with an intelligence that sent chills through everyone present. "Jesus Christ," one of the federal marshals muttered, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Nobody move," Morrison barked. "Dr. Vance, what's their behavior pattern here?" Dr. Vance studied the bears through binoculars, her professional composure cracking slightly. "This is highly unusual. They appear to be observing, not hunting or foraging. They're focused specifically on the human gathering." Hope's vocalizations intensified, and remarkably, the adult bears responded with their own calls, a complex exchange that sounded almost like conversation. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "They're his family. They've come for him." "That's impossible," Dr. Vance protested. "Bear cubs don't maintain family connections after weaning, and wild bears avoid human contact." Sarah Hendricks, who had arrived an hour earlier, stepped forward from the crowd. "Dr. Vance, with all due respect, your textbook knowledge doesn't account for the genetic line this cub represents. These bears have evolved alongside human communities for generations." "That's pseudoscientific nonsense," Morrison snapped, but his voice carried less conviction than before. The largest bear, an enormous female who could only be Hope's mother, stood and began walking slowly toward the house. The crowd parted like water, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. Federal agents raised their weapons, but Morrison held up a staying hand. "Hold fire unless I give the order," he commanded, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. The mother bear stopped 20 feet from Margaret's porch and sat down again. Her eyes, unmistakably the same warm brown as Hope's, locked onto Margaret's face. The intelligence there was undeniable, ancient and profound. Hope wriggled in Margaret's arms, making excited sounds. Against every instinct in her family's urgent protests, Margaret stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the massive bear. "Mom, no!" Jennifer screamed, but Margaret continued forward with surprising calm. The crowd held its collective breath as the 72-year-old woman approached a 400-pound predator. 20 feet became 15, then 10, then 5. Margaret stopped just beyond the bear's reach and knelt in the snow. "Hello, Mama," she whispered. "I've been taking care of your baby." The mother bear rose to all fours and took 2 careful steps forward. Her massive head lowered until she was eye level with Margaret, close enough that her breath fogged the cold air between them. For 30 seconds, woman and bear regarded each other in absolute silence. Then, incredibly, the mother bear gently touched Margaret's outstretched hand with her nose, the same greeting she'd given Tyler during that terrible night in the mountains 18 months ago. Hope chirped excitedly from Margaret's arms, and his mother responded with a low rumble that could only be described as contentment. "She's thanking you," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The moment shattered when Morrison's radio crackled to life. "Base to Morrison. Media attention has reached national levels. Washington wants immediate resolution." The spell broken, Morrison raised his weapon toward the mother bear. "This ends now. That animal is too dangerous to remain at large." "No!" Margaret's voice carried with surprising force as she positioned herself between Morrison and the bear family. "You'll have to shoot me first." Tyler and Marcus immediately flanked their grandmother, followed by Jennifer, then Sarah, then Bill Henderson and his wife. One by one, the entire crowd moved to form a human shield around Margaret and the bears. "You want to get to them?" Bill Henderson called out. "You go through 100 witnesses and every news camera in Colorado." Morrison's face flushed with rage and frustration. The standoff had spiraled beyond his control, with national media attention and federal oversight breathing down his neck. Shooting through a crowd of civilians to kill bears that were showing no aggressive behavior would end his career and possibly result in criminal charges. "Dr. Vance," he barked, "give me options." Dr. Vance studied the surreal scene through her binoculars. "The bears are exhibiting protective behavior, not predatory. They're responding to the perceived threat to the cub, but they're not attacking. If we withdraw, they'll likely retreat as well." "Withdrawal isn't an option. I have orders." "Your orders don't include creating a massacre on live television," interrupted a new voice. Everyone turned to see Congressman James Mitchell, no relation to the family, emerging from a news van. The 70-year-old politician had driven up from Denver after watching the standoff coverage. "Agent Morrison," Congressman Mitchell announced, "I'm invoking congressional oversight of this operation. Stand down immediately." Morrison's authority crumbled visibly. "Sir, I have federal warrants, which you'll execute through proper legal channels, not at gunpoint in front of national media." The congressman's voice carried the weight of decades in Washington. "This situation requires careful review, not cowboy theatrics." The mother bear seemed to sense the shift in dynamics. She touched Margaret's hand once more, then made a series of complex vocalizations to Hope. The cub responded from Margaret's arms, their exchange clearly communicating something profound. Finally, the mother bear stepped back and made a deep rumbling sound, unmistakably a farewell. She turned and began walking back toward the forest, followed by the other 2 bears. At the tree line, she looked back once more, her gaze holding Margaret's for a final moment of understanding. Then they were gone, melting into the forest like shadows. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Margaret felt only exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. She sank to her knees in the snow, still clutching hope, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Grandma!" Tyler rushed to her side, followed by the rest of her family. "I'm all right, honey," she managed, just overwhelmed by it all. Congressman Mitchell approached respectfully. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you've captured the nation's attention today, but more importantly, you've shown us something we desperately needed to see, that love and courage don't diminish with age." Morrison holstered his weapon with visible reluctance. "This isn't over. I'll be back with proper legal documentation." "You do that, Agent Morrison," Margaret replied, struggling to her feet with Tyler's help. "But you'll find it harder to bully an old lady when the whole world is watching." As the federal vehicles retreated down the mountain road, the crowd began dispersing. But many supporters lingered, wanting to personally thank the woman who'd stood up to federal agents for a bear cub. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," called a reporter from Channel 9 News, "how does it feel to be a viral sensation? The hashtag #HashedBearGrandma is trending worldwide." Margaret looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in her arms despite the chaos. "Honey, I don't care about being famous. I just care about keeping promises. And I promised this little one I wouldn't let him down." Jennifer wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Terrified, but proud. Sometimes being terrified and doing it anyway is the only choice we have," Margaret replied, echoing words her own mother had spoken decades earlier. As evening fell and the last supporters drove away, the O'Sullivan family gathered in their living room around Hope's recovery area. The GoFundMe had surpassed $25,000, ensuring Hope's care and the family's legal expenses. More importantly, they'd discovered something none of them had expected, that courage could be contagious, and that sometimes standing for what's right required everything you had to give. Outside, fresh snow began falling again, covering the tracks left by bears and humans alike. But inside the warm cabin, a family had been transformed by their choice to protect something innocent and defenseless. The battle was far from over, but they'd won the first round. And Margaret O'Sullivan had rediscovered the person she'd always been meant to be, a healer, a protector, and a woman who refused to let age diminish her capacity for love. 3 days after the standoff, Margaret's world came crashing down. She woke at 4 a.m. to find Hope listless and burning with fever, his small body racked with tremors that no amount of blankets could stop. The surgical site had reopened during the night, leaking a mixture of blood and infected fluid that stained his recovery bedding. "Tyler! Marcus!" Margaret's voice cracked with panic as she gathered Hope's limp form. "Something's wrong." The boys thundered downstairs to find their grandmother in her nightgown, cradling the barely conscious cub. Hope's breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, and his eyes had lost their bright alertness, replaced by a glassy stare that Margaret recognized from her nursing days, the look of a body shutting down. "Call Dr. Hendricks," Margaret ordered, but her hands were already shaking as she checked Hope's vital signs. His pulse was thready and fast, his temperature dangerously high. "And call your mother." Now. Jennifer arrived home from her overnight shift at the medical center to find controlled chaos in her living room. Sarah Hendricks was performing emergency surgery on the kitchen table, while Margaret assisted with the steady hands of a trained professional. The infection had returned with vengeance, spreading through Hope's system faster than antibiotics could combat it. "The sutures failed," Sarah explained grimly, her weathered hands working to clean the wound. "Sometimes with trauma this severe, the body just can't heal properly. His immune system is compromised from stress and malnutrition." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Hope's vital signs deteriorate on Sarah's portable monitors. "There has to be something else we can do. Margaret, we need to discuss options." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 40 years treating dying animals. "The infection has gone septic." Even if we could stop it now, there may be permanent organ damage. The unspoken words hung heavy in the kitchen air. Euthanasia, the kindest choice for a suffering animal. "No," Margaret said firmly. "We don't give up on family." Jennifer pulled her mother aside while Sarah continued working. "Mom, look at him. He's suffering. Sometimes the most loving thing is to let go." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 3 days. "I can't, Jennifer. I promised him. When he came to our door, I promised I'd keep him safe." "You did keep him safe. You gave him 3 more days of life, surrounded by love. That's more than most wild animals get." Tyler approached hesitantly, his young face etched with grief. "Grandma, is Hope going to die?" Margaret knelt to Tyler's level, struggling to find words that wouldn't shatter an 11-year-old's heart. "Sometimes, honey, no matter how hard we try, we can't fix everything. Sometimes loving someone means accepting that we did our best." "But his mama trusted us," Tyler protested, tears streaming down his cheeks. "She brought him here because she knew we'd save him." The weight of that trust pressed down on Margaret like a physical force. She'd failed again. Failed to save the innocent creature that had chosen her. Failed to honor the memory of the brave mother who died protecting her grandson. Marcus, typically the practical one, spoke quietly from the corner. "The GoFundMe is at $38,000 now. People from 50 states have donated. They believe in what we're doing." "Money can't cure sepsis," Sarah called from the surgical area. "Margaret, his blood pressure is dropping. We need to make a decision soon." Margaret returned to Hope's side, gently stroking his matted fur. His fevered body felt like a small furnace against her hands, burning itself out in its effort to fight the infection. "Fight, little one," she whispered. "Your mama didn't die so you could give up now." As if responding to her voice, Hope's eyes fluttered open briefly. For a moment that familiar intelligence flickered in their depths, a recognition, a connection that transcended species barriers. Then the convulsions started. Hope's small body went rigid, then began shaking uncontrollably. Sarah immediately administered anticonvulsant medication while Margaret held him steady, tears falling freely onto his trembling form. "Status epilepticus," Sarah diagnosed grimly. "The infection has reached his brain. Margaret, even if we stop this, there could be permanent neurological damage." Jennifer's voice broke the terrible silence. "Mom, we have to let him go." Margaret looked around at her family, at Tyler's tear-stained face, Marcus's barely contained grief, Jennifer's exhausted compassion. They'd all sacrificed so much for Hope's care. Jennifer had missed work, risking her job security. The boys had spent their Christmas money on medical supplies. The whole family had opened their hearts to a wild creature who might die anyway. "Grandma?" Tyler's voice was small and broken. "What would Mama Bear want us to do?" The question cut through Margaret's defenses like a blade. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the massive, gentle creature who'd died protecting Tyler. What would that brave mother want for her suffering baby? The convulsions stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving Hope unconscious but breathing. Sarah checked his pupils with a penlight and shook her head grimly. "The neurological signs are getting worse. His brain isn't getting enough oxygen." Margaret felt her world collapsing. This wasn't just about losing hope. It was about facing the reality that love and determination weren't always enough. That sometimes, despite every effort and sacrifice, good people lost and innocent creatures died. Her phone buzzed with notifications from the GoFundMe page. Messages of support poured in from strangers who'd followed Hope's story, praying for Bear Grandma and Hope. You gave him more love in 3 days than most animals get in a lifetime. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." The irony was crushing. The world saw her as a hero, but she felt like a complete failure. "Margaret," Sarah said gently, "I need you to consider euthanasia. He's not going to recover from this level of brain damage. Keeping him alive now would be cruel." Tyler buried his face in his grandmother's shoulder, his sobs shaking both their bodies. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process the failure of all their efforts. Jennifer wept silently, grieving not just for Hope, but for the part of her mother's spirit that was breaking before her eyes. Margaret's arthritic hands trembled as she stroked Hope's still form. "How long does he have if we do nothing?" "Hours, maybe less." "The fever alone will kill him. And if we help him, it would be peaceful. I have pentobarbital. He wouldn't feel any pain." The kitchen fell silent except for Hope's labored breathing and the quiet sounds of the family's grief. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the world in deceptive purity, while inside, an old woman faced the most heartbreaking decision of her life. Margaret thought about the past 3 days, the joy of watching Hope respond to treatment, the pride in her family's unity, the sense of purpose that had filled her for the first time in years. She thought about the mother bear's trusting gaze, the weight of responsibility that came with love. "Give me a minute alone with him," she finally said. The family reluctantly withdrew to the living room, leaving Margaret alone with the dying cub. She gathered Hope's fevered body close to her chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her own. "I'm so sorry, little one," she whispered through her tears. I tried so hard to save you. We all did. But sometimes trying isn't enough." Hope's breathing grew more labored, and Margaret realized the decision was being taken from her hands. His body was shutting down naturally, the infection having won its battle despite all their efforts. "Sarah!" she called urgently. "Something's changed!" Sarah rushed back to find Hope's vital signs failing rapidly. His breathing was becoming irregular, his pulse weak and thready. "He's dying," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry, Margaret. There's nothing more we can do." Margaret held Hope closer, her heart breaking with each of his struggling breaths. All their love, all their money, all their determination, none of it had been enough to save one small, innocent life. Tyler appeared at her side, placing his small hand on Hope's head. "It's okay, Hope. Mama Bear is waiting for you." As if Tyler's words had given him permission, Hope's breathing gradually slowed. His fevered body relaxed in Margaret's arms, and the terrible tension of fighting left his small form. At 6:47 a.m. on a snowy December morning, Hope took his last breath surrounded by the family that had loved him for 3 precious days. Margaret O'Sullivan's second chance at being a healer had ended in heartbreak, but the real tragedy was yet to come. The funeral for Hope took place on a gray December afternoon, with over 300 people gathered in Margaret's backyard despite the bitter cold. The tiny grave, dug beneath the old oak tree where Tyler used to play, was surrounded by flowers, stuffed bears, and handwritten notes from children across the country. Margaret stood in her black coat, still and silent as stone, while Reverend Thomas from the local Methodist church spoke words of comfort that seemed to bounce off her grief like rain off glass. "This little creature brought out the best in all of us," Reverend Thomas said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "He reminded us that love knows no boundaries between species, and that sometimes the smallest lives leave the biggest impact." But Margaret barely heard him. In her mind, she kept replaying those final moments. Hope's labored breathing, his fevered body growing still in her arms, the terrible silence that followed. She'd failed him. Despite all the love, all the money raised, all the support from strangers, she'd still failed to save one small, innocent life. Tyler leaned against her side, his own grief a palpable weight. "I keep thinking about Mama Bear," he whispered. "She trusted us to save him." Those words hit Margaret like physical blows. The great Mother Bear had brought her dying baby to their door, somehow knowing that Margaret had the knowledge and compassion to help. But Margaret's rusty veterinary skills hadn't been enough. Her love hadn't been enough. Nothing had been enough. The crowd began dispersing as the short ceremony concluded, but Margaret remained frozen beside the small grave. Jennifer touched her mother's shoulder gently. "Mom, it's time to go inside. You'll catch pneumonia out here." "I should have done more," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I should have taken him to Denver, to the university hospital. I should have—" "You did everything humanly possible," Sarah Hendricks interrupted, joining them beside the grave. "Margaret, I've been treating wildlife for 40 years. Sometimes animals die despite our best efforts. It doesn't mean we failed them." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "That Mother Bear looked me in the eyes and trusted me with her baby, and I let him die. You gave him 3 days of love and safety he wouldn't have had otherwise," Jennifer said firmly. "You gave him a family." But Margaret couldn't be comforted. The weight of her perceived failure was crushing her beneath its enormity. She'd spent her entire adult life caring for others, putting their needs before her own, and this time, the time that mattered most, she hadn't been good enough. The next morning brought devastating news. Marcus burst into the kitchen where Margaret sat staring at her untouched coffee, holding his laptop with trembling hands. "Grandma, you need to see this." The screen displayed a local news article with the headline, "Federal Investigation Reveals Bear Grandma May Have Caused Cub's Death." Agent Morrison's stern face filled the accompanying photo. Margaret's heart sank as she read Morrison's quoted statements. "Improper veterinary care by unlicensed individuals likely contributed to the animal's death. Wild animals require specialized treatment that well-meaning civilians cannot provide. This tragedy could have been prevented if proper protocols had been followed." The article went on to detail how Margaret's amateur medical intervention had potentially worsened Hope's condition, how the stress of media attention had compromised the cub's recovery, and how emotional decision-making had trumped scientific expertise. "It gets worse," Marcus said, scrolling down. "Look at the comments." The online discussion had turned vicious. What had been overwhelming support just days earlier had curdled into blame and second-guessing. "Old woman killed that bear cub with her stubbornness. Should have turned it over to professionals immediately." This is what happens when emotions override common sense. Jennifer read over Margaret's shoulder, her face growing pale. "Mom, these people don't know what they're talking about. They weren't here. They didn't see how hard you fought for him." But Margaret was absorbing every cruel word like poison. Each comment confirmed her deepest fears, that her pride and stubbornness had killed Hope, that her desperate need to feel useful again had cost an innocent creature its life. Tyler found his grandmother an hour later sitting in Hope's empty recovery area with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The medical equipment was still set up, the blankets still bearing his scent. "Grandma, don't listen to those people on the internet. They're just mean." "Maybe they're right, honey," Margaret whispered. "Maybe I was too proud to admit I couldn't save him. Maybe if I'd given him to the Wildlife Service immediately." "They would have killed him anyway," Tyler said fiercely. "Agent Morrison hates bears. You heard him. At least with us, Hope knew he was loved." Margaret's phone rang, another reporter wanting a statement about Morrison's accusations. She'd stopped answering calls the day before, unable to face more questions about her controversial decisions and tragic outcome. The doorbell brought a steady stream of visitors throughout the morning. Some came to offer support, but others arrived with barely concealed judgment. Mrs. Patterson from down the road shook her head sadly as she delivered a casserole. Such a shame, Margaret. I always said wild animals belong in the wild. This never would have happened if you'd called the authorities right away. Each comment, each sideways glance, each whispered conversation when people thought she couldn't hear added to Margaret's growing conviction that she'd made a terrible mistake. The confident woman who'd stood up to federal agents had been replaced by someone fragile and uncertain, consumed by self-doubt. Sarah Hendricks arrived that afternoon to find Margaret in her bedroom, still in her nightgown despite the late hour. "Margaret, you can't hide in here forever?" "I can't face them, Sarah. All those people who donated money, who believed in what we were doing, I let them all down." "You gave that cub the only chance he had," Sarah said firmly. "His infection was too advanced when he arrived. Even a fully equipped veterinary hospital might not have saved him." "But Morrison's right, isn't he? I'm not a licensed veterinarian. I haven't practiced in 50 years. What right did I have to try to save Hope when I might have made things worse?" Sarah sat on the bed's edge, her own weathered hands folding Margaret's trembling ones. "Let me tell you something about Daniel Morrison that he doesn't want the public to know." She pulled out a thick folder from her bag, documents, photographs, and official reports that painted a very different picture of Agent Morrison's motivations. "Remember how Morrison claimed his son died in a bear attack 8 years ago?" Margaret nodded weakly. "I've been investigating Morrison ever since Hope arrived. His son Jamie didn't die from a bear attack. The boy died from exposure after Morrison abandoned him during a drinking binge while camping." Margaret's eyes widened as Sarah spread out hospital records, coroner's reports, and witness statements. "Morrison was passed out drunk for 6 hours while his 6-year-old son wandered alone in the wilderness. By the time search and rescue found Jamie, hypothermia had already set in. The boy died 2 days later from complications." "But the bear attack was a lie Morrison created to cover his own negligence. Look at this." Sarah pointed to the autopsy report. "No claw marks, no bite wounds, no evidence of animal interaction whatsoever. Jamie Morrison died because his father was too drunk to watch him, and Morrison has been killing bears ever since to ease his guilt." Margaret stared at the documents in shock. "Why hasn't this come out before? Morrison has friends in high places, and he's been very careful to cover his tracks, but he made a mistake coming after you so publicly." "I have contacts in the Park Service who've been documenting his illegal activities for years, waiting for the right moment to act." The folder contained more damning evidence: photographs of Morrison placing poison bait stations, records of falsified reports, and testimony from other wildlife officers who'd tried to report his illegal activities. "There's more," Sarah continued grimly. "Morrison has systematically poisoned bear populations across 3 states. The mother bear that saved Tyler. She didn't die from protecting him during the accident. She died weeks later from Morrison's poison after successfully weaning Hope and teaching him to find help if needed." Margaret felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "You mean Hope's mother lived long enough to deliberately guide her cub to your family when she realized she was dying from the poison? Bears have incredible memory for scent and location. She remembered Tyler's smell from that night in the mountains and spent her final weeks teaching Hope to find his way to your house." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Hope hadn't wandered to their door by chance or instinct. His dying mother had literally trained him to seek help from the humans who had shown kindness, knowing that her own death from Morrison's poison was inevitable. "Margaret, listen to me carefully," Sarah said urgently. "Hope was going to die regardless of what you did. The poison his mother ingested was passed through her milk during his final weeks of nursing. By the time he reached you, his organs were already shutting down. The infection in his paw was just the visible symptom of system-wide poisoning." Margaret's grief transformed into something harder and more focused: rage. "Morrison killed them both. the mother and the baby. Yes, and he's been using Hope's death to deflect attention from his own crimes. But we have him now. The FBI Wildlife Crime Unit has been building a case based on the evidence I've collected. They're planning arrests within the week. Margaret stood up for the first time in days, her back straightening with renewed purpose. What do we need to do? We need to tell the truth, the whole truth, about Morrison's lies, about the poisoning, about why Hope really came to your door. As Margaret absorbed this information, she realized that her guilt had been misplaced. She hadn't failed Hope. She'd given him the only love and comfort available in his final days. Morrison had killed him weeks before he'd ever arrived at her door, and had then used her grief to further his own twisted agenda. The woman who'd been crushed by self-doubt began to re-emerge, but now she carried something she'd never possessed before: righteous fury at a system that protected men like Morrison while blaming women like her for trying to heal the damage those men caused. "Sarah," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, "I want to hold a press conference. It's time the world learned the truth about Agent Daniel Morrison." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and pale winter sunlight began breaking through the clouds for the first time since Hope's death. Margaret O'Sullivan was about to discover that sometimes the most devastating revelations could become the foundation for the most powerful kind of justice. The battle for Hope was over, but the war for truth was just beginning. The press conference took place on Margaret's front porch exactly 1 week after Hope's funeral. News crews from across the country had returned, drawn by Sarah Hendrick's promise of explosive revelations about federal wildlife management corruption. Margaret stood behind a makeshift podium, wearing her best navy dress and her mother's pearl necklace, looking every inch the dignified grandmother the media had initially celebrated. But this wasn't the same broken woman who'd hidden in her bedroom, consumed by guilt. This Margaret O'Sullivan radiated quiet fury and unshakable determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air, "I stand before you today not to defend my actions, but to expose the truth about Agent Daniel Morrison and his systematic campaign of cruelty against innocent creatures." Sarah stepped forward with the damning folder, spreading documents across a table for the cameras to capture. "What you're seeing here are 8 years of falsified reports, illegal poison deployments, and cover-ups that go straight to the federal level. The revelation that Morrison's son had died from parental negligence, not a bear attack, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. But it was the photographic evidence of poisoned bear carcasses and Morrison's illegal bait stations that truly stunned the reporters. "Agent Morrison didn't just fail to save Hope," Margaret declared, her voice rising with emotion. "He murdered Hope's mother with illegal poison, then used my grief to deflect attention from his own crimes." Jennifer stood beside her mother, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened to their family. "Morrison turned us into scapegoats while he covered up mass wildlife poisoning across 3 states. Tyler, now 12 and more articulate about his trauma, spoke directly to the cameras. "Mama Bear didn't just save me that night in the mountains. She taught her baby to find us when she knew she was dying from Agent Morrison's poison. Hope came to our house because his mother trusted us to love him." The impact was immediate and explosive. Within hours, Hack Justice for Hope was trending worldwide, accompanied by demands for Morrison's immediate arrest and investigation into federal wildlife management practices. The GoFundMe, which had stagnated after Hope's death, surged past $60,000 as donors learned the truth about what had really killed the cub. But Morrison wasn't finished fighting. That evening, as Margaret's family celebrated the successful press conference, federal agents surrounded their property once again. This time, however, Morrison wasn't leading the operation. FBI Special Agent Linda Torres, a stern woman in her 40s with decades of experience in wildlife crime, approached the house with a very different demeanor than Morrison had displayed. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm here to inform you that Agent Daniel Morrison has been arrested on multiple federal charges, including violation of the Lacey Act, falsification of federal documents, and conspiracy to cover up the death of a minor. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it nearly buckled her knees. What happens now? Now we clean up the mess he's made, Agent Torres replied grimly. Morrison's illegal activities have contaminated wildlife investigations across multiple states. We're reviewing every case he's touched in the past decade. The arrests didn't stop with Morrison. Over the following weeks, a network of corrupt federal employees, complicit veterinarians, and paid-off officials began tumbling like dominoes. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, where congressional hearings were announced to investigate systemic problems in wildlife management. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moment came 3 months later when she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived on a warm spring morning with news that would change everything. The distinguished wildlife biologist from the University of Colorado had been following Hope's story from the beginning, and her research had uncovered something remarkable. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need to show you something that will help you understand just how special Hope and his family really were. Dr. Rodriguez spread out maps, photographs, and research data across Margaret's kitchen table. For the past 15 years, I've been studying a unique population of black bears in this region. They're genetically distinct from other North American black bears, with significantly higher intelligence and an unprecedented capacity for forming bonds with human families. Margaret leaned forward, fascinated despite herself. Hope's family line represents one of the last surviving groups of what we call companion bears, bears that evolved alongside indigenous communities for thousands of years before European settlement. They're not just intelligent, Mrs. O'Sullivan. They're capable of genuine emotional attachment, cross-species communication, and what can only be described as love. The photographs showed bear families that had been documented helping human communities for decades, warning of forest fires, leading lost hikers to safety, even sharing territory and resources during harsh winters. Morrison targeted this specific population because their human-friendly behavior made them problematic for federal management policies. He's been systematically poisoning them for 8 years, trying to eliminate what he saw as a dangerous anomaly. Tyler, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. So, Mama Bear really did love our family? Dr. Rodriguez smiled warmly. Tyler, what that Mother Bear felt for your family was as real and deep as any emotion humans experience. And when she realized she was dying from Morrison's poison, she spent her final weeks teaching Hope not just to find you, but to carry on her legacy of love. Margaret felt tears welling up, but this time they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of wonder, of validation, of finally understanding the true magnitude of what had happened in her home. There's more, Dr. Rodriguez continued. The evidence you helped gather about Morrison's activities has enabled us to save the remaining companion bears. We've identified 12 surviving individuals from 3 family groups, and they're now under federal protection. Jennifer, who had been quiet throughout the explanation, finally spoke. What about Hope? Does this change anything about how he died? Hope's story saved his entire species, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Without the attention his death brought to Morrison's crimes, we never would have been able to stop the poisoning program. In a very real sense, Hope's sacrifice protected every remaining companion bear in North America. The full circle of redemption was completed 6 months later when Margaret received her honorary doctorate in veterinary science from Colorado State University, the same program she'd been forced to abandon 50 years earlier. Standing at the podium in her graduation cap and gown, surrounded by her family and hundreds of supporters who had followed her journey, Margaret delivered a commencement address that would be quoted for years to come. "Dreams delayed are not dreams denied," she told the young graduates. "I'm 73 years old and I'm just now becoming the veterinarian I always wanted to be." Age is not a barrier to purpose. It's simply the wisdom that comes before the greatest adventures of our lives. The Margaret O'Sullivan Wildlife Sanctuary, funded by the GoFundMe donations and ongoing support from around the world, opened that fall on a 100-acre plot adjacent to her original property. Sarah Hendricks became the head veterinarian, while Margaret served as director emeritus and chief rehabilitator of orphaned bear cubs. Tyler, now 13 and passionate about wildlife biology, spent every free moment at the sanctuary learning to care for the injured animals that arrived daily. Marcus had developed a social media following of over 1 million people who followed his updates about the sanctuary's residents. Jennifer finally quit her second job and became the sanctuary's full-time administrator, using her organizational skills to coordinate with wildlife agencies across the western United States. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came on the first anniversary of Hope's death, when Margaret was awakened by familiar sounds outside her bedroom window. 3 young bear cubs sat in her backyard, each wearing a makeshift collar of woven grass and carrying small bundles in their mouths, berries, flowers, and what appeared to be shiny stones. "Gifts," Dr. Rodriguez explained when Margaret called her in amazement. "The surviving companion bears are teaching their cubs about your family. You've become part of their cultural memory." Margaret knelt in her garden as the cubs approached cautiously. The largest one, a female with distinctive white markings remarkably similar to Hope's, came closest. When Margaret extended her hand, the cub gently touched her palm with her nose, the same greeting Hope's mother had given her during that unforgettable standoff. "Hello, little ones," Margaret whispered. "I'm so glad you found us." As the cubs played in her yard under their mother's watchful eye, Margaret realized that Hope's legacy was far greater than anyone had imagined. He hadn't just exposed corruption or saved his species. He had created a new kind of family that transcended biological boundaries. Tyler joined her in the garden, now tall enough to rest his chin on her shoulder. "Do you think Hope knows what happened, about the sanctuary and everything?" Margaret watched the cubs tumbling through her flower beds with pure joy, their playfulness a celebration of life that Hope never got to experience. "I think he knows, honey." "I think he's right here with us, in every life we save, every family we heal, every moment we choose love over fear." The morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, warming the sanctuary where impossible connections bloomed between species, where love proved stronger than law, and where a 73-year-old woman finally became the healer she was always meant to be. In the distance, Hope's mother watched from the tree line, no longer alone but surrounded by the family. Margaret's courage had saved. The circle was complete, the promise kept, and the legacy of love continued in ways no one could have imagined. Family, Margaret had learned, wasn't just blood. It was whoever showed up when you needed them most, regardless of species, age, or the impossibility of it all. Dear friends, Margaret O'Sullivan's story isn't just about a bear cub, it's about rediscovering your purpose when the world tells you your best years are behind you. At 72, Margaret felt invisible, useless, living on scraps while everyone around her moved forward with their busy lives. Sound familiar? How many of us have felt that crushing loneliness, that sense that we're just taking up space, that our dreams died decades ago with our youth? But when hope appeared at her door, something awakened in Margaret that had been sleeping for 50 years. Her healing hands, her fierce protective love, Her refusal to let age define her limits. These weren't relics of the past, they were the foundation of her greatest adventure. Margaret didn't just save hope, she saved herself. She proved that at 73 you can still become the person you were meant to be. Your experience isn't a burden, it's your superpower. Your tender heart isn't weakness, it's your greatest strength. The world needs your wisdom, your love, your refusal to give up on the innocent and defenseless. You're not too old to matter. You're not too late to make a difference. What dream have you put aside that's calling to you again? When did you last feel truly needed by someone or something that depended on your unique gifts? Share your story in the comments below.